A few prepared questions we already had from the team. We heard this morning from General Stephen Day about the ASD, Australian Signals Directive Top 35, a number of recommendations that are mandated for companies to follow. The question is, should the use of these recommendations be actually legislated? Should we be forcing companies to actually use these recommendations to protect themselves from cyber? A little bit like it wasn't until the use of seatbelts or bicycle helmets were mandated that they became commonly used. I know, where's Jorge? You've got a view on that, I know.
Hello.
Hold it right up.
Yeah. I'm not specifically familiarized with this ASD 35.
Yeah.
I understood that there are like 35 different mitigations, and there are a few that are strongly recommended. But what I do think that ideally the companies should have internal standards that should be above the legislations. So let's take the example of SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley procedures. When we implemented SOX within Checkpoint, we found out that the majority of our internal procedures were already covering what is required by SOX. So an ideal situation, a company should find mitigations and security protections that should be above these protections. Unfortunately, many companies are not doing enough or are doing the minimum just to get the certification. So since this is the reality, I do think that legislation is required.
So, Jorge, you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley came from the US, so maybe we've got to have our US speaker speak about that one.
Oh, well, I'm not an expert in Starbucks, but show me somebody who's gotten in trouble for not paying attention to what they're supposed to be doing on Starbucks. I think in general, the less that governments do legislatively on trying to fight cybercrime, the better off most of us are going to be. I think there's been a lot of discussion over the years, and particularly recently, about information sharing and finding ways to, increase information sharing. I don't know about you guys, but it doesn't seem like we have an information sharing problem, not where I'm from anyway. The problem seems to be that we're not being creative enough in finding ways to enforce our existing laws. And a lot of that starts with the stakeholders, the companies that are most directly impacted by cybercrime. And so anything we can do to help those companies find creative ways, incentivize the creative ways to enforce existing laws, I think is a good thing.
To that as well.
Mark, you have a view? Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My last role was a Chief Risk Officer at Serco, so I mentioned that because that's the lens in which I want to sort of address this question. In that role, I've got to look at all areas of risk: operational risk, technology risk, information security risk, financial risk, health and safety, and so on. Part of my role also was responsible for compliance. Now, where I get uncomfortable, where I think legislation get us unstuck, is when you look at your compliance program and you look at your risk profile and they're apart. So in other words, your compliance program isn't actually mitigating your risks because someone else has decided these are the things you should be worried about, as opposed to, well, actually, these are the things we need to be really worried about. And I really liked the talk this morning, what does success look like? Because that is actually the question we need to be asking ourselves. And I think one of the root causes in organisations is capability. If we can actually address capability, we'll actually go a long way to addressing this issue.
Okay, great. And
I was going to say I spent a number of years supporting something in the U.S. that we had in the government space called FISMA, where that essentially turned into checkbox security, where organizations were making sure that they met the minimum and did everything that they needed to legally do and check that box and move on with their day. So I don't think that mandating that makes the most sense, or legislating it, but what I think might also make sense is to hold those organizations accountable for not doing the minimum to at least protect their data, protect their assets.
Okay, so if we move on from legislation, if we're not going to legislate, should there be more publicity of cyber breaches? Companies are often protected of this due to their brand. Maybe we can hear from a customer of ours at Optus.
Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah.
Singh from Optus. Sorry, what was the question again, Kurt?
Should there be more publicity of cyber breaches? Is there a
I think
responsibility
absolutely.
to disclose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've seen good success of this overseas, and I think, in Australia, I think there's been certainly organisations that haven't had to expose that type of information. I think there's a duty of care, obviously, to all of their customers to disclose that information, but also from a Privacy Act perspective, there's a promise from these organisations that say we'll take this information and use it only for a specific purpose. And if that information is then stolen or it's mishandled in some way, there's absolutely a requirement, in my belief, that they need to expose that and make it public.
Yeah. Any other views?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you look at what's happened in the US versus the EU and with breach notification, I think in the US it's definitely this kind of public flogging of organisations who come forwards, and to the extent that their legal teams spend hours and days trying to justify why they shouldn't notify, because, it's not an incident, it's not a breach. It's not an incident, it's not a breach. And, kind of like not going with the spirit of the law. And in Europe, it's very much more around privately notifying the regulator in a particular industry, not publicly. And then if there's repeat offenders, then they get fined and then it's published. And I guess my question would be not to discourage people from looking at what's going on their networks. And if you look, you will see stuff. And if you think you're going to get fired for raising that up the board chain because you've got to notify, then you're not going to do it. And I'd be very wary of anything that disincentivises people to actually look at what's going on their networks.
Okay, great. Should we even ask the journalist in the panel this question?
Well, I'll take it slightly. Yeah, you know where I come down on this. But look, it would be nice if we had more disclosure about how organizations got hacked and then how they fixed it. We almost never hear about that. Tremendously useful and impactful information, but hardly anybody talks about that, mandating that, at least in an anonymized way, which would actually be really interesting and useful. What you wanted to?
I just wanted to add to that, but I'll wait till you finish. Okay. I think what does happen, though, in particular industries, in Australia, and in the financial services sector, this happens. Behind the scenes, they're fiercely competitive out in the marketplace, but behind the scenes, we actually talk to each other and actually get into that detail of how something has occurred, what the current threat state is, what's keeping us awake at night, and addressing those issues. It doesn't happen in the public domain, I agree. Should it? I've got mixed views about that. I don't want hacking to be glorified. The more you publish it, I think there's actually there's a risk that someone might go and do something because suddenly now you can get on the front page of the newspaper because you've done something. So it's sort of like the cricket ground. They don't show streakers on the cricket match anymore because they don't want to glorify that. And I worry about that aspect of it.
Okay. So maybe we'll go to the next question before I maybe go to the audience, because the questions are still coming in on the live Twitter feed here. So, but we'll take one more on the same theme of sharing information, because I think the defence of this is all about how we share information. The threat intelligence. Is there enough threat intelligence being shared today between organisations? And maybe we've got the man from CrowdStrike to kick that one off.
Thanks. Yeah. There's a lot of threat intelligence sharing that goes on within various communities, and I think that there's, depending on what business vertical you're talking about, how they're sharing information. If you look at the FSI SAC, that's probably one of the most advanced and one of the best examples of information sharing, and I think a lot of business verticals are trying to move into that. One of the things that does concern me is a lot of the public disclosure of the tactics, techniques, and practices of these adversaries, and kind of just putting it out there for marketing's sake. And that's one of the things where I think information disclosure, information sharing has risks as well. If it becomes public, the adversary is watching that. They know that these things are going on. If you talk about them publicly, they're going to stop doing it and they're going to change their behavior. And we had a great example of that last year with a Russian threat actor that we track as Energetic Bear. There was a number of public disclosures about them, and they stopped functioning. Now, that activity was picked up by another group with a completely different set of tools and techniques, but the fact that it was publicly disclosed kind of caused it to go back underground. So that's where there's a risk.
Jorge.
Sharing information between security vendors, I don't think we have enough, although there is some cooperation. But what I wanted to mention that sounds a little bit like advertising, if we look at the example that we have in Checkpoint, something that the name is Threat Cloud. Threat Cloud is that all our customers can opt to share their findings in an anonymized way. And today we are collecting information from more than 16,000 different organizations. So we have like a incredible huge net of sensors in the world. And in some way, all our customers are sharing their findings and all the anomalies so we can analyze, immediately develop some protection and update everybody. So in some indirect way, there is this type of sharing information.
Okay, great. So we might now just go to the audience now and get any questions from the floor. There's a couple of roving mics out there, over here and there. Do we have any? Just stick your hand up and the microphone will be incoming. Don't be shy.
Bueller.
Come on. Nothing. Okay, down here, there's someone with a hand up down here. You can come around. It's always hard to get the first one, but after that they'll be coming in. Go.
Hi. With the recent Prime Minister and Cabinet review of Australia's cybersecurity, there's been a lot of submissions around the need to increase the number of cybersecurity professionals in the industry. Is that really the way we're going to master this threat that we have from cyber crime, cyber espionage? I'd like to hear people's opinions on that.
Yeah, I would agree with something that somebody said earlier today. I forget who it was, but most of these problems come down to human issues. They're not technology problems. They're implementation problems, or they are, look, most of hacking is social engineering or exploiting the people behind the keyboard. It's not breaking directly into the system itself. And I think one of the things we've seen over and over again with some of the biggest breaches over the last few years is the companies had all of the intel they needed to understand that they were completely owned by the bad guys. They just weren't looking at it in the right way, or they were depending on automated systems to give them and to synthesize this intelligence into something that they could actually use. I don't think that you can outsource that to a machine, not yet. Anyway, so for the foreseeable future, I think, it's going to be real important for us to build up that workforce.
But in that vein, I think that those people need to be properly trained. And, there's a lot of people that are now getting into cybersecurity thinking, there's a lot of money in this is great, this is a great way to make some money or whatever. If they're not properly trained, if they don't understand the very basic components of what it is that they're doing, and they want to start off and be a high-paid cybersecurity person, then they're probably going to do more harm than good.
Yeah, I just follow up on that real quick. I can't tell you how many times I've met somebody in a C position in security at an organization, and I'll just ask them some basic questions, like just for giggles, about TCP/IP to see if they actually know about what the hell they're talking, what they're supposed to know. And it's remarkable how often they don't even have that basic knowledge about the stuff that is the building blocks of everything else.
Great. Any more views on that? Education, I guess?
I think the other challenge, so I completely agree with what's been said. Capability, to me, there's no silver bullet to anything, but if you were really able to target one thing, it would be capability. But with that capability, in terms of getting the investment your company needs to make into these areas, I still think there's a bit of a disconnect in risk language, in being able to articulate what the key risks are to an organisation, so that you can get the attention of the risk committee, you can get the attention of the board, you can get the attention of the CXO on these matters to get the right investment. So one of the things I think we need to focus on is actually looking at risk management as a key to being the language in which to explain, here are the issues that we're dealing with, the risks that we're dealing with, here's the investment required. I think one of the problems we get is we get challenged by the risk committees to aggregate risk, and then you oversimplify, or it becomes so generic that it doesn't actually achieve much. So I think resist that would be one of my key points of advice too, and get a bit more granular where you can, and say, well, actually there are 3 risks, there's not one, and we need to be granular about it.
Okay, great.
I guess one thing to add from me, having been a new arrival to the country sort of 3 or 4 months ago from the UK, I am amazed at how few university courses there are here that have basic security modules on them, whether it's computer science, information systems, or even MBAs and so on, when you're talking about digital and disruption and being an entrepreneur and those sorts of things. And I think if there's one thing that could happen here is there should be far more focus on generating some really good academic courses, so that when people come through, they are able to talk to the board people as well as the techies, and kind of, it's also a growth industry, as we've heard, so you can actually export that expertise into Asia and actually get a kind of some growth in the economy there as well.
Yep, that's a great point. So we might just go again. Are there any other questions from the audience before we keep going on the Twitter feed? We've got one here down in the front centre.
Hi, Narelle Clark from the Internet Society and also ACAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network. I'd like you all to comment a little on a couple of things, and that would be, of course, first of all, the Internet of Things. Surely as we, since we've adopted all of these mobile devices, we've lost all of those good security indicators that the user had on the front end, like little padlocks on the screen that showed you something was using some encryption, off now into these little cut-down apps that barely show you anything about how the device is communicating with the outside world. And so now if we move across into the Internet of Things world, we have all of these consumer devices being deployed everywhere where you've got no idea whatsoever about the communication between your TV and goodness knows what, where or otherwise. So if you could all comment a little bit on that, and then perhaps maybe we could move on a bit to IPv6.
Internet of Things, if we could maybe get the telco perspective, Greg, to kick that off.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. There's probably 2 ways to look at Internet of Things. One is that there is the private network side, and people always tend to Thanks. Yeah, people tend to look always at the public network side of Internet of Things, but there is definitely a private network side where there are contained networks, contained communications for devices. If people are saying, look, I'm really worried about the signal my toaster is putting out, is the element going to go bad or something, and is someone going to hack that? That could be a problem, but is it really an issue? And if it is, maybe I can put that inside encrypted communication. So there's definitely different schools of thoughts around the different devices that we'll be talking, but I would say don't lose sight of the fact that a lot of it will be private network, and that's the way we're seeing it at the moment, particularly from the telco perspective, people building private infrastructure and then dedicated pipes then out to other places. Thank you.
Okay.
I actually think you raise a really good point. I'm a big fan of Apple Watch, Apple iPhone, and I like Apple because they simplify things for me. But the big risk with that is they oversimplify and they take away the user empowerment. So in other words, if I'm not educated enough to know what's good and what's bad and what I'm doing, and in other words, I'm meant to just trust what's under the hood, I actually think we start to introduce risk into the community who use these devices. So I think there is a balance, and I don't think it has been struck yet, between making sure we understand what it is we're doing with the devices that we're touching and using every day, keeping it simple to use, but actually understanding what it is we're doing. I think there was a TV manufacturer, there was a warning, I think it was just over a month or 2 ago, saying if you buy this TV, there's a risk that that camera could actually be recording you and sending the information back somewhere else. So it is a real concern, and I don't think as an industry we've got on top of it yet.
Great. Any more comments on that? Something for James? Or
I don't know about Internet of Things.
What about IPv6? There was a
IPv6. Oh, yeah. Talk about things I hope never really actually happen. Seriously, I mean, we're not ready for it. Everybody says, "Oh gosh, we need IPv6 because of this IPv4 address shortage." But frankly, it's terrifying thinking of a future in which everything is IPv6. I mean, think about how we have to reimagine everything about security and the way we do defense, because this is a technology, an approach that essentially massively favors the bad guys. I mean, we think about just just scanning, or trying to write firewall rules for things with IPv6. I mean, forget about it. Like, blacklists are gone. You know, half the stuff that our industry is built on fails to work when this becomes massively adopted. So I don't know. I don't worry about the Internet of Things too much. I mean, I feel like a lot of this stuff is going to be shipped broken, and it's going to be baked in, and there's no way to fix it except to actually upgrade it to the next thing. And thankfully, that'll probably be the way that we upgrade our Internet of Things. You just buy the next rev of it, and hopefully they fix it then. But with IPv6, that's a whole huge can of worms, and that keeps me up at night. So.
Okay, great. We might go out for another question. Do we have another question over there, Chris? We do. If you could just state your name and company, that's always useful to know where you're coming from.
Hi, my name is Katrina Avila. I'm from IBM. My question is around risk management. When we talk about risk management in cybersecurity, we often frame it in terms of mitigating risks to end users, customers, and employees. But what we really mean is mitigating those risks only as far as it will affect the organisation. So my question is for the whole panel, but specifically also for Brian, who mentioned a little bit around the role of government and legislation in cybersecurity. My question is, who champions risk management for the end user? And is it right that organisations are accepting risk on behalf of end users?
Well, you've been called out, Brian, so you've got to start that first one.
That's a tremendous question, and you're asking a lot of things there. You know, for the longest time, I used to say that ISPs, internet service providers, for example, had an obligation to their customers, I don't know if they actually consider them customers, their users or whatever, that they have an obligation if they see a threat coming to that customer, if they see that customer trying to access a known threat, that they have an obligation to do something about that. I've not really seen an ISP that actually takes that attitude, or at least talks about taking that attitude. Usually it's sort of, hey, we'll just clean it up after they get compromised. Who stands up for the little guy? I don't know. I honestly don't know. That's a great question. I sort of subscribe to the view that most of us only care about security after it's become painful in some very personal way. So, you know, I tend to think that everybody needs to have their own learning experiences, and hopefully they build upon that in a way that's meaningful for them going forward. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
Shall we just keep working our way down the panel, because I think this affects us all.
Yeah. I think a good risk management framework will take into account shareholders, will take into account employees, and will take into account customers and suppliers as well if you're heavy in that space. Where I see the customer view or angle really being paid attention, and it's a selfish one unfortunately, is where a company wants to branch out on a new platform and encourage the customers to move from, say, traditional way of doing something to a more cheaper way of doing something online. So then to get customers to move across, you start to put yourself in the customer's shoes. What are going to be the barriers to doing that? And you start to see the kinds of risks, etc., and they're being addressed. But I agree with you, there is a limitation as to how far an organisation will go with that in general, just operational risk. And it probably is a space there that we can improve on.
Do you still have the microphone, whoever asked that question? Because I want to ask a clarifying question, which is, were you asking about consumers and risk management, who's watching out for a consumer, or are you talking about, you know, some other aspect of enterprise security?
Consumers mainly, but basically everybody who uses the systems that you're trying to secure.
Well, I think that those people should be responsible for it. I mean, if you're using a computing system and you're using some end product, I think that, you know, we should expect that people need to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more informed. And there comes, you know, perhaps that's where the government's role or somebody else's role from an education standpoint comes in. But, you know, the fact that these Indian call center where they call you up and they get you to give them remote access to their computer, and then they charge you $200 to remove the malware that you didn't even know you had. The fact that people still fall for that, I think, says something about our ability to educate consumers and educate people that are using these things. And I think that we should start expecting more from the user to be a better practitioner of security.
We'll hear from James. Cheers.
Okay, so I think there were a couple of points there. I kind of agree with Brian to agree around, people need to have some personal experience before they will use those computers and tools better and manage their own personal risk. But I also agree with that comment just then that there does need to be some education. Maybe it's schools. I've noticed that all these schools are rolling out iPads, giving them to kind of 7 and 8 year olds and so on who haven't, A, probably shouldn't be using them, and B, they'd be giving email accounts to log into, make prezos and all this sort of stuff, and with no education at all about how to use those appropriately. Now, in the real world, if you go into a shop and you buy carving knives or shotguns or whatever, there's quite a lot of kind of education that make people aware as they're growing up that these are dangerous, need to use them responsibly, and so on. When you buy a PC or a
That's kind of a problem that takes care of itself, doesn't it? I mean,
well, interesting. I mean, when you talk about, you talk about Internet of Things, and you're talking about fitness devices, pacemakers, healthcare. Actually, if you start to hack around with some of those things, or planes, it will result in loss of life. And actually, people will suddenly wake up to reality of the risks that are out there. And hopefully it doesn't come to that, and we realise beforehand. But if we don't manage it, then that risk is real.
I want to add one thing if I can. I'm sorry to hijack if you had something to say, but I actually think we are on the cusp of a different type of way that companies treat their customers on the issue of security. In the past, you bought a router from Best Buy, and it was maybe made by some big router maker, and all the defaults were off. All the security was off. The systems were extremely hard to use and to make secure. So I think we're entering into an era where we're starting to see companies that understand that first of all, they have respect for their users to start with, and they understand that their users maybe don't want to be security experts to actually use these devices securely, and they're taking steps to make it easier for people to secure these devices. And we're starting to see this in crowdfunding, startups. I mentioned the routers. There's a really good example of this. I'm blanking on the name of the company, but they make it super easy for you to deploy very powerful, very next generation technology, and you don't have to understand any of it. So I think we're getting there to the point where people stop putting up with the fact that they have to become security experts to use these devices securely.
We'll keep pushing on and hear from maybe Greg from Optus.
Yeah, look, I think the question's really around the individual and who's protecting the individual and who's helping to manage the consumer's risk. And very much, I think the consumer really needs to really manage their own risk in a lot of ways. And people have a lot of ways in which they will communicate with the wider world about their experience and some of the bad things that have happened to them. They'll talk about things in social media. They'll be published. They'll often be, if it's something that's bad that's happened to them, say from an experience of purchasing or doing business with some organisation, that information will often go much wider than what the actual problem was, and it'll stay and be very persistent in places like social media, so much so that other people could be well affected by that. So people actually do have a very, very strong voice today to manage their own risk and have it be known where they've had problems. And I think in this way, people actually vote with their feet, so to speak, and they're able to manage the risk for themselves and also for their fellow consumers.
Great. Jorge, you're actually my CIO, so I already know your stance on risk, so it's not very tolerable, so can't use anything on my laptop.
I think it's very difficult to set...
It's all locked down.
I think it's very difficult to set the limit what is a risk and to communicate to the end user. I mean, you can take it to every area. Let's say a printer company should also be responsible for what is printed, and with the 3D printers, it's endless, all this. So, and I think that instead of asking the questions about what is the responsibility of the companies of the risk management. I think we can take the discussion to something that you asked in the previous question, is about responsibility also to notify the users when something happens. And I think companies are investing a lot in what we call risk management, and executives are very aware of the risk management and the defense and the protection. And I'm not sure if the executives are responsible enough to require from their companies a response project, if they have a response action or plan in case something happens. And today all the attention is on the protections, and executives are not requiring from their companies to define what is their policy or to respond when there is a notification or something needs to be notified, which is also a major responsibility.
Right. So look, we've got about time for 2 more questions. I'll go back to the Twitter feed so we give some people listening to the live streaming a chance to ask. There was a good question that came in. Where do you think the threat landscape is heading in 2015? We've heard from some keynote speakers on this, but what are your thoughts about the threat landscape we're looking at in the next year? We'll go back that way.
Yeah. The main one is what we repeated again and again, unknown threats. Unknown threats is the main risk right now, and for that reason I think what we need to install in 2015 is all the protections for the unknown threats, and I mentioned a few of them, like threat extraction, threat emulation, the protection that was shown today on the mobile that can check a lot of unknown threats. This is the main. I think the whitelisted and the blacklisted is more from the previous years.
Well, that's what you see. What about down at Optus land?
Yeah, absolutely the same. Look, the threat landscape is on the up and up, and I think what's going to make the difference is going to be how well the people that have the information, the threat information, can share it with one another and help to mitigate the problem. I think the sharing is absolutely key in solving the issue.
So what I would say is, what I think is going to happen in 2015 is I think we're going to see a greater appreciation that people aren't just stealing data for financial gain, they're also destroying data, as in the Sony Pictures hack. And I think that's a real turning point. We spoke about turning point earlier on the vendor side, but I think on the threat landscape side, actually, ransomware is going to go up a notch, okay? It's going to get far more aggressive in how it's sent out there, how it can take over networks, how it can be used to trash data. I think what you really need to focus on is, as well as the unknown threats, is being resilient. Okay, so are you simulating an attack? What would happen if you didn't have an email system for a couple of weeks? How would you work? As a board, have you got an agreed process for that? And just becoming more resilient and say, okay, it's not if it happens, it's when it happens. You can guarantee something will happen. Are you prepared?
I see the threat landscape in 3 planes. There's the targeted intrusion, which is typically conducted by an actor that understands who the victim is and has specifically targeted that victim in order to steal information, perhaps to disrupt systems. In the case of Sony Pictures, I think it was pretty clear what happened there. The other 2 planes are on the criminal, which is more opportunistic. These are the threat actors that they don't really care who you are or what your business is or what you're doing, and they want to get as many compromises as possible. And then the third plane is the hacktivist, activist, nationalist. These are the Syrian Electronic Army and the other anonymous type actors that have some message that they like to convey, and they're going to, again, in some cases conduct this attack opportunistically, and in other cases it'll be targeted. And I think what we can see over the next year, we're going to continue to see a tremendous amount of targeted intrusion activity. If you look at the 5-year plan from China, if you look at any of the policies, stated policies of various foreign governments, they all see the effect of cyber and how they can leverage that to advance national objectives, and we're going to keep seeing that. On the criminal side, the evolution is going to be, I think, starting to look at additional ways to target payment processors, payment systems, things like Apple Pay, all of these emerging technologies that will have maybe not technical vulnerabilities, but certainly social vulnerabilities where they can take advantage of human, because that's really where we see a lot of the attacks occurring, is taking advantage of the human, not so much the technical side. And then the hacktivist-activist side, I think as we continue to see cyber kinetic conflicts spill over into the cyber realm, where we have ISIS, we've got situations in Syria, Egypt, all over the Middle East, also in various East Asian countries. I think we're going to continue to see that activity generate more cyber activity, targeting of media organizations and kind of high-level, high-visibility targets.
I think intellectual property theft is going to continue to rise. It's traditionally obviously been in the financial space, but I think we'll see more as more and more intellectual property comes online. That is going to be a key mix. But I also think the hacktivists is an area of real concern. I think more than, in a long time, we live in a society that's full of opinion, polarising views, and that really motivates ideologists who are out there that want to make a statement. And I think, it only takes two people or one person that wants to do that in a big way. And that is an area that I think we're going to see more and more of. And I think one of the panellists just mentioned earlier, around the sort of the denial of service or destruction of data, defacing of sites, and really pushing that ideology. I think that's going to be a key area for us to address.
Yeah, I don't know. I see a lot of room for growth. I don't know if it'll happen. I see a lot of room for growth in terms of situational awareness by the opportunistic attackers, the financially oriented guys, partly just because I spend a lot of time looking at those guys. But, when you break into an organization and you've got CryptoLocker on their, backup server, and you go, oh, it's going to be $500 to get your data back. Who's laughing? I'm laughing. I'm like, why? If these guys had clue one about the real value of the data that they'd already encrypted and stolen, they would ask for a lot more. So I see an enormous room for growth in the opportunistic attacks as these guys continue to get better situational and awareness about where they are. Right now, a lot of those attacks are very cookie cutter. But I think as organized crime continues to get more entrenched and involved in these activities, you're going to start to see these guys get better, more aware of where they are and how much the data that they have at their fingertips is actually worth.
Great, thanks, Brian. I know that Brian's got to fly out. He's heading up to Queensland very shortly, but I know the rest of the panellists are going to be here during the coffee break and probably networking drinks at the end, so please feel free to hit them up with some one-on-one questions. I'd like for you to put your hands together and thank them for their insights, and we'll move on with the next speaker. Thank you.